It's been a long journey, but we're finally reaching the precipice of the Marvel vs. Capcom series proper. All of the games I've played and noted under the banner of MVC, I'm aware haven't actually been called Marvel vs. Capcom at all. In fact, the very early ones didn't even feature Capcom characters, but I've been working by Capcom's own broad definitions of where this series begins, i.e. from X-Men Children of the Atom onwards. With today's game, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, we're at the very end of that pre-Marvel vs. Capcom set of games, the last moment before Capcom started throwing every character they could together into one big brawl-em-up. You're listening to the almighty Backlog. I'm Ellie, and today's review is on Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, available for arcade, PC, PlayStation 1, PlayStation 4, Saturn, Switch and Xbox One. This review is based on the PC version. Originally released in July of 1997, developed and published by Capcom, it's a fighting game, and How Long to Beat has an average playtime of about 2 hours. Still, it's not like Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is a slouch when it comes to its roster. As is the want of these games, most of the fighters are actually sourced from the earlier games in the franchise, with the occasional update to their movesets, so if you've been playing through these games, you'll feel immediately at home. This winds up feeling a bit like a strength and a weakness all at once. On the one hand, recycling fighters gives the developers opportunities to refine and tweak them, but I think it also diminishes somewhat the excitement of starting up a new fighter only to see you know all these characters already. In fact, I think that speaks to a wider problem with these pre-Marvel vs. Capcom games. While I do think there's a notable difference between, say, its beginnings with Children of the Atom to here, those changes begin to feel slighter and slighter with each game, to the point where the jump from X-Men vs. Street Fighter to here is fairly minuscule. That makes the game come across as less like a brand new adventure and more of what is sometimes called a mission pack sequel. That is, in some ways, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter feels more like a full-priced expansion pack. That feeling isn't helped by the way the game recycles even some of its backgrounds from previous ones, and the final boss is the exact same giant apocalypse fight as the game immediately before this one, albeit this time now it's followed by a throwdown against a robotic Akuma to wrap things up. In some ways, one can't imagine much reason to ever revisit X-Men vs. Street Fighter after playing this, unless you really prefer playing as members of Professor X's fighting force. Many of the new Marvel members of the roster here are just drawn from Marvel superheroes like Captain America or Blackheart, so they're not really new characters. This is also true of the Street Fighter characters in the roster, most of whom return from X-Men vs. Street Fighter, though there are a few absentees and new faces. Most notable of these are Cammy and Charlie, neither of whom make the cut for this game. On a personal note, the omission of Cammy was a surprise, since I tend to think of her as one of Street Fighter's core players, but in their place are Sakura, one of my mains, so that's a big plus for this game, and Dan Hibiki, the infamous joke character of the franchise. Like a few of these games, this one also uses a tag system for its fights, so you fight in a team of 2. However, new to the franchise is the presence of assist moves. These might well be a staple of fighting games these days, but in 1997 they were still in their infancy. In fact, they'd only been introduced to the genre a mere 2 years earlier in the now relatively obscure Marvel game Avengers in Galactic Storm, developed by Data East, a prolific developer of yore. That game you probably don't know, since it never made the leap from arcade cabinets to home consoles, but it did feature a slender 8-character roster alongside a roster of assistants, from whom you could select a character to summon into the game to perform an attack alongside you. If you're unfamiliar with fighting game parlance, that's basically what an assist character does. Over the years, the mechanic has shown up in myriad ways, but the fundamental aspect of using a character other than your main one remains immutable. The Marvel vs. Capcom franchise proper is well known for its use of assist attacks. In fact, you could make the argument that it became the poster child for the mechanic, and indeed, while you can play all sorts of games nowadays that use team-based combat in which your backup fighters can be called in temporarily, it's reasonable to point at Marvel vs. Capcom as the genesis point from which they are inspired. That mechanic had began somewhere, and for Marvel vs. Capcom, that somewhere is here in Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. It might sound like I'm harping on a bit with it, and perhaps I am. However, that's sometimes the nature of things when you're trying to communicate the importance or impact of a mechanic that has long since become a standard feature in many modern games. While Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter's implementation of it isn't particularly exciting to a contemporary audience, it's certainly a major step in the development of the franchise, and much of the later success of the Marvel vs. Capcom games owe a lot to its focused adoption of it. Now, over the course of these reviews so far, I have to admit I've not been incredibly kind to the pre-Marvel vs. Capcom games. While I recognise that they are instrumental parts leading up to at least a couple of games widely held as among the best in class in the genre, I still feel like there's something very rudimentary about these games that I think it's probably fair to say I tend to hold Capcom's work to a somewhat more exacting standard, if only because I find it incredible that the company that made something as timeless and exciting as Street Fighter 2 could also churn out, say, Children of the Atom. Of the pre-MVC games, the only one that I've had much positive to say about before has been Marvel Superheroes. Not this game, but the previous one called Marvel Superheroes, which I largely enjoyed for its wonderful implementation of the Infinity Gems gimmick. Perhaps it's something in the name then, that Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is the other of the pre-MVC titles that I find myself being complimentary towards. The thing is, as far as fighting games go, it's fine. I appreciate that's not especially good critique or analysis, especially not for someone who's been doing this for over 8 years. The level of quality I've come to associate with the pre-MVC games is, in all honesty, not stunningly high. That's not to say that you can't have fun with these games, because that's not true. As is always the case with fighting games, they come to life when you've a friend hanging around and time to spare to throw down. This game having assists opens up a massive amount of tactical play on both your part and your opponent's, as understanding how your backup character interacts when called on as an assist is vital to mastering the game. I have found that sometimes these early MVC games are quite rough in how their combos feel to pull off, or often quite punishing, as is the wont of arcade-era games, but the two Marvel Superheroes games at least give you fun tools to work with along the way. There's no escaping, though, that these games, when taken as a quartet together, feel very iterative. That is to say, I find it hard to recommend doing what I've done and going back to play each one in sequence because, frankly, by the time you reach this game, there's not really tons left to see and you're playing the most refined version of the same thing. They might have slightly different rosters or stages, but ultimately the amount of recycling of characters and movesets makes each subsequent game feel less like a sequel or evolution and more like an expansion. I think that's why I like Marvel Superheroes the most out of the four, because at least it has a unique gimmick. If you do find value in video game history though, like I do, then there's very little that ought to get in the way of your trying these games, as they're all available in a collection on modern systems. But the experience of playing that collection is weird, because you really feel how small the growth is in between the games, at least until you reach Marvel vs. Capcom proper. If you want a decent fighter, you certainly aren't likely to regret trying Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. The mechanics work perfectly well, the assists are fun, and the spread of characters is broad enough to satisfy most people, unless you're an avowed X-Men fan, I guess. Though it's made largely redundant by its more famous successors, there's nothing wrong with stepping back and seeing where the series' roots began. The final score is 4 out of 7. Good. Sure, maybe something doesn't quite work, but at least it has heart or a spark of excitement that makes it worthwhile despite the faults. Worth a go if you can find it on sale. This has been Ellie on the Almighty Backlog. You can support this project by reading the review over on thealmightybacklog.wordpress.com, or by listening to the pod review hosted on RSS and YouTube. Please feel free to follow me over on Mastodon, Blue Sky and or Backlogged by following the links on the website. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so by donating via PayPal to thealmightybacklog@gmail.com, or by hitting the donate button on the blog. Thank you for listening and have a lovely day.